Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's video we continue our exploration of Nginx, the warp-powered web server. So today we're going to talk about the vhost file configuration in a little bit more detail. And for most people have a more than passing familiarity with Apache's vhost file. So the Nginx vhost file in concept are exactly the same. They determine the configuration, the file locations, the domain information that your web server will look for, and where it will direct that content request from when it receives it. So there are some differences in how that is set up for Nginx. So we're going to take a look at some of the basic ones today, and how to translate what we've seen in Apache vhost configurations so that they run as expected in Nginx. So in the previous video, all we did was made a copy of the default configuration and set up a new path for our configuration, so that if we do a links HTTP and a local host, it will just give us this is our new config and index. All we did was remove or change the content directory from user share nginx HTML to var dub HTML, which is the more default standard that everybody's looking for. So let's go ahead and create a sample site using a new domain and a new vhost file for that domain. So the first thing we want to do is, in our case, we're going to be testing locally. So let's just edit our host file, and we'll decide what to call our example. And in fact, I think that's probably the best idea. So let's find our IP address. And in my case, my Linux Academy lab server is 172.31.105.111, and I'm going to call it www.myexample.local, and that way I won't confuse that with anything else. So we're going to save that, and we'll just do a ping on www.myexample.local. And if you don't get anything but the IP that you put in the host file, then your DNS is set up to look for external DNS and then files, rather than files and DNS. That's a different topic for DNS configuration, but it is covered in one of several places on our Linux Academy website, tutorials for the Linux 101 and 102 classes. So feel free to check those out if you haven't already. So www.myexample.local is actually the name of our site, and the next thing we need to do is we need to make a directory that will contain our content. So let's do a make directory on var html, and we'll just call it myexample. And that's where we're actually going to put our content. And all that we're going to do for our content is we're going to put www.myexample.local as the content in var HTML, and my example in the index file. So now we're going to go ahead and change to our Nginx directory, and as we've talked about in our standard configuration tutorial, we created a vhost.d directory that will contain all of our vhosts. Now there's two ways that you can do this. You can edit the default configuration and just have it by default answer for all requests and direct them to the myexample index.html file. But that's effectively what we did the last time. We're going to take a little bit more of a detailed look of how to set up a new vhost configuration so that it works for our purposes. So now that we've created the page, we want to create the actual vhost file. And we're going to create a simple vhost file as follows. So I typically will name my vhost file so that it matches the most common URL that I'm going to answer for from within my vhost. In this case, we're going to do www.myexample.local, but make sure that you put in the .conf at the end, because if you'll remember, in our nginx.conf configuration, we said to load anything that's in vhost.d as long as it ends in .conf. One of the more common examples is you'll create a vhost and you'll forget to put that .conf on the end, and you'll beat your head against the wall while you try to figure out why your configuration isn't being picked up. So now we have a blank file. So there's a couple of directives that are required for our vhost to actually mean anything to our Nginx system. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up server. And this actually defines the server itself, the vhost server that we're talking about. We need to tell it to listen on port 80. Now, if we were running a IPv6 system, we would do a listen and then colon in brackets colon 80 in default. And then we would turn on IPv6 only if that's all we were listening for. In this case, we're listening for IPv4, so that's not necessary. The next thing that we want to tell the system is the root file system for our domain. And in this case, it's var www html and my example. And then remember, you have to put a semicolon at the end of each line. It designates that that line has ended. We're going to then tell Nginx that our index files can be any of the following in a list. And it's a space tabulated list of files that can be anything that you want. In this case, we're going to say index.html, index.htm, and index.php. And as we continue to explore our system and add functionality to it later, we won't have to re-edit this file in order to add the PHP file when we add PHP-like functionality. The next thing we need to tell it is we need to tell it the server name. And the server name in this case is www.myexample.local. And we can give it multiple, again, space tabulated local versions or shortcut names, effectively aliases. So this is the server underscore name in Nginx is a combined version of the Apache server name and server alias. So in one line, we're saying that anything that comes into www.myexample.local, which would typically be an Apache server name, by adding a space and then adding another item, in which case we'll call it just my example, that is effectively a server alias for our site. So now that we've got that, these are the basics. This is all we have to add to our system in order for it to function correctly. And once we've added a local host entry, and it's in our vhost directory. So let's just go ahead and save this. And as we talked about before, one of the things that you'll want to do when you create a new configuration or make any changes is you'll want to do an nginx-t. And in this case, it tells us that we haven't made any mistakes. You can purposely make a mistake if you would like to make sure it's actually picking up your configuration. So we have two files in here. We'll re-edit our www.example, and we'll just put some kind of nonsense in here. And if we then test our configuration again, it will tell us that, yes, I'm picking up your configuration file, myexample.local.conf, and there's something in it on line 6 that doesn't make any sense. So we're going to go ahead and remove that, and we'll save our file, and we'll rerun our nginx-t. So we've tested our configuration, and at this point, all that we need to do is reload our configuration, which will now pick up the ability for it to serve effectively two types of domains, the local host and the www.myexample.local, and it should also serve the server alias of myexample. Because if you look at that, we have a tabulated list that says www.myexample.local and myexample. These are just simple vhost configurations. We're going to get into even more advanced things like error logging, custom logging, directory handling for different locations, etc. But right now, we've added a basic vhost for myexample.local and its alias. So we'll go ahead and clear this, and we'll do a links HTTP. And if you remember, we still have our default configuration that is set up. In this case, this is our new config and index. So if we quit out of that, we should then be able to do a links HTTP and www.myexample.local, still picking up our new config and index rather than the index file that we set up. Well, that's because what we haven't done is we haven't done a server nginx. Now we can do a couple of things. We can do a reload, which will just reload our configuration without affecting anybody who's connected to our site. Or we can do a restart, which will drop all existing connections and reload the entire configuration files. In this case, we're testing locally, so we don't necessarily care that we're disconnecting anyone. It's just a local test. So we've done our service Nginx restart, and again, it will tell us OK. That's why we did the Nginx-T, so that we didn't interrupt a running system with an invalid configuration. And now, if we run our links http myexample.local, we'll see that we get the new configuration file. And we haven't affected the ability of it to serve our localhost information as well. And if we've done everything right, we should then be able to do a myexample, and we'll see it also serves the myexample host file that we created, because we had a server alias created in our vhost configuration, as well as a full www.myexample.local configuration. So we've now added the ability for our system to host multiple websites, as well as server aliases in a basic vhost configuration. So now we're going to be looking at how to do upstream and proxy configurations as we go forward. And then we'll also take a look at how to install and configure PHP and do user authentication through MariaDB as well as PostgreSQL. We'll continue to build on these concepts going forward. But for changing and creating our vhost configuration files for multiple domains, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.